So welcome everybody, panelists, and welcome to participants who are watching and who will watch this in the future on the website of Classical Academic Press. Just a brief background on what this is. Classical Academic Press has started a series called Disputed Questions about various questions related to classical education, questions that many of us bandy about in our own heads and with each other all the time anyway. So Classical Academic Press has a list of disputed questions, and it has invited 2 or 3 dozen people to submit 800 to 1,000 word responses to those questions, which it then posts on its website and is hosting webinars like this one, where it's bringing together a few of the contributors to talk to one another, to hear from one another, to ask each other questions, and to refine our own understanding and articulation of our answers to these questions. And the hope is that it enriches the understanding and articulations of people who are watching. And I think it's a great resource for faculty at K-12 classical schools. All of the essays are on the website. I can easily see downloading them, printing them, and using them for your professional development. I mean, I think you have a year's worth of faculty meetings just in the first 2 rounds of essays. So these, I think, are a great resource. So thanks to Classical Academic Press and to Marissa and Chris Perrin and Jolie Hodge for coming up with the idea and hosting this all. As most of you will know who are watching, the topic, the disputed question for tonight is which books are the great books and why are they great? So in a second, we will get to some introductions and start asking some questions and having some conversations. But I'll point out that the phrase great books, I think, is relatively recent. We typically associate it with Mortimer Adler's great publishing enterprise, though I think the first person to use it in print was Frederick Harrison in 1886 in an essay on, I think it was just called On Choosing Books or something like that. So relatively recent, but it probably has precedent in things like lists of the 10 great Attic orators and Cassiodorus's book Institutions, which has lists of authors and books in different categories. So long history in liberal arts tradition of thinking what books should we read, but the idea and phrasing of the great book seems to be relatively recent, unless one of my panelists wants to inform me otherwise. So one note, and in the essays that we all submitted, I identified kind of 4 elements that recur throughout all of the essays that I'll just name here, and then we'll move into some introductions, but just so we're aware. One, a lot of the essays reflected on characteristics of the great books, what makes a great book great and what doesn't make it great. This is Gary's Methodism model. So having characteristics that then we use to measure books against. Examples of great books, this is Gary's particularism. Several people identified great books and said any book that resembles this one must be great. Chris Schlecht and a few others reflected on reading the great books, what it takes to encounter a great book and be impacted by that great book. And then a few people mentioned criteria for selecting among the great books for a curriculum. So given that there are arguably hundreds of great books, which any school decides to read with its students in a given moment in time, will depend on a certain amount of pedagogical prudence, and some of the essays commented on maybe a selection criteria. So just so we have those basic elements out of the way, let's do some introductions. And as Marissa just said to everybody, if you have questions during the course of the seminar, put them in the Q&A box. Marissa will be monitoring those, and at the end of our webinar, we'll definitely have time for Marissa to draw some of those questions to our attention. So I know lots of people on the screen, but not everybody, and not everybody well, and many people watching won't maybe know any of us. So let's go around, and I think I'd like just to hear your name, what you do and where you live, and then if you would just name but not comment on one or two of the first books you encountered that indicated to you or that woke you up to the idea that not all books are created equal, right? So think about, was there a book early on that was your first kind of introduction to or participation in a great book? So I'll just use your first names, and then I'll let you, just because we don't have any, we don't have to rely on people just jumping in. So Heidi, let's start with you. So tell us who you are, where you are, what you do, and then a book or two that you think, oh yeah, that was my first introduction to the great books.
Great questions, Brian. My name's Heidi White. I live in Colorado Springs. I am the Dean of Academics at St. Hild School, which is a K through 12 integrated hybrid program, classical nature immersion program. I also teach the high school humanities courses, ancients through moderns there. I'm a homeschool mom, and I'm a regular host at the Close Reads podcast network. And then I do a whole lot of consulting and writing and things like this. So thanks for having me here. I would say the first great book that I encountered, I mean, I kind of want to say other than the Bible, right? Like
Other than the Bible, yeah.
Yeah,
if you
for
it's like
most of
desert
us,
island discs, if you go to
yeah,
a desert island, you get the
I
Bible,
don't even,
complete with Shakespeare, yeah.
yeah. To your point, Brian, I don't even think about it necessarily as just like spiritual formation, but it also was an awakening to me of the beauty and the idea that we have 66 books talking to one another across time and space and having a conversation that unfolds formative spiritual truth. That's what I mean by the Bible. Probably also for sure the Iliad and the Odyssey. And then Shakespeare's Much Ado About Nothing.
Okay, great. Gary, let's go to you.
Hi, my name's Gary Hartenburg. I'm the director of the Honors College at Houston Christian University, which is a great books program for students to do their undergraduate liberal arts education through. I also teach logic at the homeschool co-op my wife started in the area. And that these days, that's, well, not these days, it's summer, but that's a lot of fun. Typically more fun than teaching college students in a way is teaching 8th graders logic. So I really love that. Yeah, so in terms of the first great book, or the first book I read as a book that sort of made me aware that books were a thing, was probably Kierkegaard's Fear and Trembling. And for the specific reason that it's got all of, like, if there's like a menu of things you can have in a book, you just click select all and win with it, because it's got like a preface, it's got an introduction, it's got sort of prolegomena, it's got 3 different main chapters, it's got interpolations and everything, and it's really kind of like bursting at the seams with things you can do in a book, as opposed to, like, for example, the Iliad, which is great, but you just start with line 1 of the poetry and you go through line whatever of the poetry, and it's all there, right? It's all the poetry. But Kierkegaard was the one where I was like, oh wow, this is a book. Like this is all the things you can do with a book.
Yeah.
So that'd be my answer.
Okay, that's great. Carrie?
Hello, my name is Carrie Eben, and I am from Siloam Springs, Arkansas. And so what do? I've been in classical education for about 24 years in various roles, spanning across homeschool and private school. Right now, I'm a consultant for K through 12 education. I do professional development, and I also work with Society for Classical Learning, doing cohorts and webinars and workshops with them. I also am a humanities teacher, an integrated humanities teacher at John Brown University during the fall season. And I founded a classical academy in my neighborhood in the last 5 years. There's Anika.
Hey, Anika.
Hey there. I'm also, I want to say I'm a CRC master teacher. I don't know what that's hard to say, master teacher, like because I'm still learning, but that's probably one of the best things I've ever done. So thank you, Andrew Kern, for all your work there in the apprenticeship. But my first great book that I encountered, I'm going to go way back to when I was about 5, and I encountered Hans Christian Andersen, his fairy tales, The Little Mermaid. And I'm not talking about, this is pre-Disney version, and it was so sorrowful and beautiful that I would read, and I actually had it in a tape recorder form too, the Super Scope Storytellers. I don't know if anybody else remembers the Super Scope Storytellers. It was a green tape that I would play, you know, and when you hear the chime, turn the page. But I would read variations of that book over and over and over again. That was something I kept going back to. And then I would say another children's books that my 4th grade teacher helped me love was the Chronicles of Narnia. We read them all of them in 4th grade. And then I have to say that literature was ruined for me in junior high and high school. And I can't remember loving anything literature during that time until really, I think I was in the CRC program and my first year, and I fell in love with the Aeneid. So I had so many crazy emotions about the Aeneid. So I would say that's my first, prior, after, elementary school. That was my first great book experience where I thought, okay, now I get what everybody's talking about. So.
Oh, that's great. Welcome, Anika. We're going around just doing introductions and inviting people to tell us who they are, what they do, and then 1 or 2 books that were their first introduction to the great books, or reveal to them that not all books are created equal. So, Junius, you want to tell us who you are, what you do, and feel free, as others have done, to provide a little commentary if you want on the books, but more importantly, just give us the books that you first encountered.
All right, got it. I'll try not to go too long. So my name is Junius Johnson, and I'm a theologian and a philosopher and a literary scholar. I run Junius Johnson Academics, which is a place for me to offer synchronous Zoom courses, both for adults and for children in those areas, and also in advanced Latin courses and digging into Latin grammar. I've got a Latin poetry course running this week, which is a lot of fun. And I also do a lot of writing about all of those things, about the classical tradition, about beauty, especially beauty and wonder and imagination, and looking at those things from a theological perspective. And I do teacher trainings and curriculum consulting for classical schools and things of that nature. I live in Memphis, Tennessee, with my wife and 2 children and a cat, who's awesome. So the first book that I read that would be on someone's list of great books was Shakespeare's Julius Caesar, which I read in 7th grade. I was told not to read it. My teacher brought it in with a bunch of other books that we got to choose from by accident. And when I picked it, she was like, "Oh, how'd that get in there? That's not supposed to be there." And I was like, "I want it." And she's like, "No, that's too old for you." And I was like, "I want it." So she let me read it, and I loved it right away. I loved the language of it. I went around speaking in Shakespearean English for about a week until both parents and teachers threatened me to stop, which is, that's everything that's wrong with public education in my mind. Anyway, but I don't think that didn't awaken me to anything other than Shakespeare specifically. Before that, I had learned that books were amazing from The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, because I learned that books could take me to places that I couldn't go in my normal life, and books could create possibilities for me that I didn't see in my normal life. And that's what I've most desperately felt that I needed as a child, was different possibilities than what my world was offering me. And I've sort of been riding the wave of new possibilities opened for me by books ever since. And they've really allowed me to not only have to do and be the things that I have seen before, because I can find new things that I would never have imagined and chase those things as well.
Yeah, beautiful. Carol?
I just want to thank the Classical Academic Press for providing us with this opportunity to come together and talk about all the things we love to talk about. My name is Carol McNamara. I am the director of the Great Hearts Institute for Classical Education, which is something like an institute, a think tank within the Great Hearts America's classical academies, public charter tuition-free academies. And I only began there about a year ago, and not quite a year ago. And before that, I basically devoted my life to teaching great books and political philosophy at universities and building academic startups, you could say, at universities in Utah and Arizona. And I guess my if we're going all the way back, my first love was, Little Women, because I thought I was going to be a great writer of fiction. And then it turned out I was not talented in that way, and so I became an academic. But so I could still write, but and I guess, Shakespeare, The Tempest showed me that literature could be philosophic, and the Republic taught me that you could in my first year of university that I could examine questions and that I hadn't even thought were questions in the past.
That's great. Hey, let me invite people who are watching, participants, to put in the chat your own first books, the books that you first encountered that introduced you to the great books, because I'm sure everybody watching this has their own first book or two. So as you're doing that, let me move on. Andrew Kern.
Hi, I'm Andrew Kern. I'm with the Circe Institute. I am basically an insecure wannabe driven by the vice of curiositas, who wants to be like Junius and be fluent in Latin, Greek, and about 8 other languages. But in order to compensate, I work with Circe and do teacher training and read every chance I get. And I did write a book, actually, that I just recently finished. The story behind the first book is that when I was in 8th grade, my teacher said, "We're going to read The Wind in the Willows this year." And I said, "Oh, I love that book." And then she handed it out, and I realized that I'd never read it, because when she said Wind in the Willows, I got the echoes of Narnia in my soul, and that's what I thought she was talking about. So I don't know when I first read them, but the Chronicles of Narnia were by then, definitive. So yeah, that's probably the first. That would have to be the first book, I think. The first book.
Yeah, John Mark. You're on mute, my friend. John Mark. There you
My
go.
wife has long wished to have a mute button to control me. So this is probably, if she's watching at all, an apex moment for her that I can be muted. I'm John Mark Reynolds. I started as the first and only employee of the Torrey Honors College at Biola University, which grew successful enough to get rid of me, to their great blessing, sent me off to Houston, where I was the provost of Houston Christian, now Christian University, and then decided for my sins that we should start a college dedicated to providing one-on-one Oxford-style education for everybody who can't afford to go into debt to go to college. So we started the St. Constantine School, named in such a way that all the people we wouldn't like would never want to come to our school. So you pick the name St. Constantine, because it just eliminates a certain kind of person right away. You want to do justice in the world, raise up a republic of Constantine and Helens. And so and we started a K through 12 that's integrated with the college. Here it's about 550 students in Houston, and we're starting a school in Pittsburgh this fall, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and then Dallas, Dallas and God willing Denver in the preceding fall. So we're excited about that. I work with the best people on the planet. Those who can't do anything end up being teachers. Those who can't teach become college professors. Those who are lousy professors become administrators. And those who are bad administrators become presidents of the college. And so that describes my entire career trajectory in many ways. How did I run into great books? I had an awesome set of grandparents who were storytellers. And in telling me the ancient stories of the Appalachian people, many of which they kind of had experienced because they repeat themselves, I came into a conversation with my ancestors and with other people's ancestors that grew and grew and grew. And then somewhere around 5th grade, 2 things happened to me. I ran into That Hideous Strength, which I think I've read every year of my life since then. I don't want to tell you how many times I've listened to it on Audible, and almost everything I've done has had traces of reflecting on that. But in reading that book, because I am bizarre, as you've already detected, I ended up trying to find all the sources of everything there. And of course, ended up like one does with Lewis in Plato, and never quite escaped the gravity of Plato's Timaeus and his Atlantis myth. From the Atlantis myth, I ran into all things Elven and J.R.R. Tolkien. But simultaneously in 5th grade, they made me do a book report on a poet, something that I had no experience with. So I went to the library and just looked up poets in 5th grade and ran into Langston Hughes. And in falling in love with the poetry of Langston Hughes, I then was engaging in a voice that was recognizably not Lewis, but like Lewis, in a deep reflection on this same great conversation that had begun with my grandparents in ancient stories, had been reflected in Narnia, in things like Lewis's myth making, Tolkien's myth making, and then deep roots in Plato, but deep roots then in Plato himself extended to Egypt, extended to India, and crossed the world. So became really in love with a great conversation that I felt like anybody could enter into.
That's great. John Mark Langston Hughes was born just down the road from where I grew up. I think I drove down Langston Hughes Boulevard every day of my life for about 25 years.
Man.
So yeah. Anika, are you able to join us and introduce yourself?
I think she's still laughing.
I am here. Can you all hear me?
We can hear you. So tell us who you are and what you do.
And please forgive my camera. I'm having horrible connection problems. So please forgive my camera.
Right.
I turn it on and off to laugh with you when you say things that are funny. I'm Anika Prather. I have been in academia for the past, I think, almost 5 years. I'm recently newly appointed as assistant professor at Catholic University, and I'll be chairing their elementary education program. I'm really excited about that. And I often feel like I'm in imposter syndrome because I kind of got to this classical education, classics world by accident. I was a dissenter at first, and then I became obsessed with them. And through my parents starting a classical school. And my parents were classically educated. They did not realize it. And they classically educated us. They did not realize that's what they were doing. And so through them, I came to fall in love with quite a few books. The Chronicles of Narnia, of course, and Little Women. So when you all said those, my heart really jumped. But there's one book in particular, 2 books in particular. My parents were such a blessing. They put my brother and I in the early 70s in Christian schools from pre-K through 12th grade. And those Christian schools often exposed us to what I now know to be the canon, and 2 books that let me know the difference between books were Perelandra and Watership Down.
Yeah.
And I remember just falling in love with the books and books that I felt were like those books that had, and even then as a young child, I couldn't articulate what it was I knew. I just knew they were different and better for my mind and better for my soul. And so I would like to say that at that time, before I ever knew anything about classical education or my parents could identify that's what it was, being exposed to that literature, I think prepared me for many years later coming in contact with the classical tradition. And then once I began to read it as a 30-something-year-old person 20 years ago, my brain immediately went back. My mind immediately went back to that time as a little girl reading Chronicles of Narnia literally every year, The Hobbit every year with my parents, or Little Women, and then Perelandra, and then Watership Down, and the light bulb went off, and that connection probably infused the passion that I have. Aspire, because I know what it did for me.
That's beautiful.
Yeah.
Thank you, everybody. I think that's everybody. For those who don't know me, I'm Brian Williams. I'm Dean of the Templeton Honors College at Eastern University outside the great American city of Philadelphia. And I think for me, like many of you, it was Narnia, but also there was a grade 2 book that I got from my Scholastic book order that was just all the Greek myths. And I think I just lived and devoured and ate and drank that book, which introduced me to the great Greek myths. Sometime in high school, a teacher put in my hands Brother Lawrence's The Practice of the Presence of God. And I think that was an introduction for me to spiritual classics that just, that spoke to me. And I knew there was more than I had in my own soul after reading that. And then in high school, I had a teacher in an advanced government class take us through Locke's second treatise of government. And that excited my mind in a different way. This carefully reasoned, long argument. Carol, I see you nodding your head. That I just thought, I want to do this, whatever this is. So, thanks everybody. That's an introduction. How I'm going to run this evening, I have a number of questions that we can get to, but I'm going to identify 2 or 3 of you at a time and throw questions and quotes to you and ask you to respond rather than all of us trying to elbow our way in, if that's okay. So first question here is I'm going to read a comment. We don't have our wonderful dear poet with us, Christine Perrin, tonight. But I'm gonna ask Anika, Carrie, and Andrew to comment on a line that Christine put in her essay. And here's the line from Christine. Books plant a seed of reality that can grow in us. Our goal is to find the books that carry those seeds. All right, listen to that again from Christine. Books plant a seed of reality that can grow in us. Our goal is to find the books that carry those seeds. And I'd love to hear Andrew, Carrie, and Anika just reflect on that. What do you hear Christine saying in her line, books plant a seed of reality that can grow in us?
Brian, I'm so glad that you asked me that question, because that was actually one of the quotes that I highlighted that I thought, and Christine wasn't here on this call. And so I wasn't sure if we were going to get to talk about that. But of course, I love the way that she has metaphors and uses the seed of reality. And so I was thinking about, I've been thinking a lot this summer and writing about what is poetic knowledge and what does that mean? What does that look like? And I'm getting closer to what that is. But I really like how she said that it is the seed of reality, and that there's something that happens within us that a story can do that kind of ignites and cultivates an inclination towards a beautiful first principles. And I think Andrew talks a lot about this too in his essay about the logos, about the word that and I think he even used the word first principle as well. But there is a universal truth that we all have access to, and that stories are the things that reflect that that reality in us or to us.
Yeah, Andrew or Anika, what do you hear Christine trying to get at there?
I'm Yeah, I'm reflecting on what I shared earlier about, which is the first time I've really articulated what I just said earlier. The way reading those books back when I was a child caused me to identify the books I should be reading as I grew older, and it's like when I came and understood the classical tradition and reflected on my experience, I felt like I was home. So I feel like there are times where in the world we don't feel like we're home. We feel out of place. But I felt like as a child reading those books, I remember my mom giving me Little House in the Big Woods, and I had to read all of Wilder's books, every single one of them, just being lost in those spaces. And I think the reality for me, and so the seed of reality that was planted into me, say, for example, reading something like Little House in the Big Woods was family is so important. Like with family, you can get through anything. And that it doesn't matter if your family is rich, poor, it doesn't matter where they're from, what their background is. If you have your mom, your dad, your siblings, and that strong father figure, which is what I had, I identified with that, right? And it felt like home. So as I went on and began to read different literature, not that every piece of literature had something about a family, but it definitely had something about community together, fighting against something. And as a result of that togetherness, they were able to overcome, right? So we think about the Chronicles of Narnia. If I'm reading Perelandra and they're trying to survive, right, in that space, and I read something like the Chronicles of Narnia, the sisters and brothers are fighting against this. That sense of community. I think that's what drew me into these books. Is you're constantly seeing it usually wasn't just one person against the odds. It was usually a community of people, a family unit, a sibling unit, a friendship, some gods, whatever, that sense of strength, that strength coming from community, coming together to fight against a foe. And that felt
Anika, are you saying that's one of the seeds of reality that was planted in you?
Yes, that in togetherness, in community, whether it be family, friends, gods, goddesses, together you can overcome something big.
Yeah. Andrew, what about you? How do you hear this line from Christine? Books plant a seed of reality that can grow in us, and our goal is to find the books that carry those seeds.
I love that phrasing. When I first encountered it, I didn't really have any idea. Well, I didn't know what she meant, and I think Anika just drove it home for me. So Anika, thank you. I think of it this way, that when we think of reality, there's a tendency, I think, to go one of two directions. One is to say, this is it, right? This world that we live in, this is it. And it's kind of miserable unless you get lucky, but this is it. And the other is to say, no, there's something more. Like Brian, you said, I love the phrase you used earlier. You said something like, you encountered, I knew there was more. I knew there was more than I had in my own soul. Right. And parallel to that, just as there's more in your own soul, there's more in reality than just what we see. But we don't always encounter it. We're not always conscious, we're hardly ever perhaps conscious of it. And one of those things is what Anika said, that there's the need for community. I think one of the most significant lessons in all of reality that is obscured and blinded by the brokenness of the world is home, the sense that I belong here. And for me, reading the Odyssey really drove that home, right? That we belong in this world. It is home to us. And we belong in this world as a community sharing it together. And it's not a world that's just trying to destroy us. It's not a world that we need to team up in order to go to abolition of man or that hideous strength. It's not a world that we need to impose order on. It's a world that has an order in it, and that we should correspond our souls to. And if we do rather, if we can correspond our souls to the realities of the world that aren't just sitting in front of us, obviously, then our souls gain more, right? And so there's seeds of reality, like this is home, like we love each other, like this is a good world. Those are seeds of reality that books can plant in our soul. And I think Lewis was a master of seed planting like that, a master, which is why probably every single one of us has been influenced by his writing. In fact, I don't think there's anybody in the English-speaking world that hasn't been influenced indirectly, at least, by his writings, because he was so good at planting those seeds. So that's how I understand it, is that the reality that we live in, it looks sometimes just absolutely miserable, especially if it's D-Day and you're at Omaha Beach. But it's not only that. The reality that we live in is very beautiful, and books can help us not just see it, but not even just perceive it, but receive it into our soul, so that it can grow.
Yeah, it's beautifully said. Carrie, your line about Anne of Green Gables made me think this made me think of your line too, that Anne is a kindred spirit whose soul saw an articulated mind when I was 11. Sounds like there's a seed being planted there, that somehow you knew something was happening there that then, I don't know, grew. I would assume.
Well, Anne has, I think one of the reasons, and I should have listed, of course, Anne, that was probably the only redeeming story in my whole middle school years was reading Anne. I forgot to, there was hope in middle school, and that was Anne. And she saw my soul, like she helped me realize that I could see with my soul. So she was a soul seer, like, she totally came together with those that she was in relationship with, that she was in community. And Anika, you mentioned community, and that was very important to her. And she needed a home too, like Odysseus. And so one of the reasons why that book resonated with me is because I saw myself in her. I had a longing, just like she did, for something real, even though it was in the imagination, the imaginary world. A lot of times she was still dealing with the reality and the truth and the nature of things and people, which I think was just kind of the beauty of the book. She saw that nature, she saw that in literature and poetry, saw that in the people around her.
May I just say something really quick? That you're right, Carrie, that what she's remembered for her is imagination. But what struck me, just as you were saying that, is what precedes her imagination is a stunning receptivity to the glory and the wonder of existence, of reality. And that's why she was so imaginative.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Would any of our other panelists like to comment on this line from our resident poet, Christine Perrin? The books plant a seed of reality that can grow in us, and our goal is to find the books that carry those seeds.
Is Anika's hand up? Is that what that is?
Anika, is that, are you like high-fiving me, or have you something you want to say? Because I'm up for both.
No, I just wanted to connect with what Carrie was saying about Anne of Green Gables. When I say I'm obsessed with her, like she's my sister and my best friend, and I'm so obsessed with her.
She's my mistress,
right? With for my 50th, my husband took me on a cruise to Canada because my
right.
children and my husband presented me with the collection of all of her books for my 50th. Because of that connection, that seed that was planted in me. I discovered her in college. That ability to, no matter how abandoned you may feel in the world and how ugly your world may seem, the way she was able to find joy and beauty. I love what Andrew said, that the world may seem really ugly to us and really dire, but the way, right, John Mark? But she was able to find beauty in everything. And then through that, she created this community that gave her the ability to overcome so much. Because I discovered her at a time where I was so unsure of home and who I was, or even my own beauty, actually. And in her, I was able to see how to navigate that, how to figure that out.
Beautiful.
What a gift books give us like that. Would anybody else like to comment on this line? If not, I have another line I'd like to take here.
Can I just
Yeah,
say
Gary.
something? Sorry. It's still very strange to me that this happens because I don't like Anne of Green Gables like very much at all. It's very long, it's boring. There's many words. It's just like, oh, okay. Like I haven't read it in a long time. Maybe if I went back now, I would enjoy it. You don't have to apologize for philosophers everywhere. But
Yes,
so I'm not saying that I'm right about this, but it's just always in a way very strange to me that books that connect with some people on a very deep, like intense way, just other people like myself, it's just like, oh, I don't like, I'm excited about your excitement for Anne of Green Gables, but I am not excited about Anne of Green Gables. And I hope we can still all be friends, but maybe we can't. No,
Can I comment on that? I've been thinking about this a lot. Brian?
Yeah, absolutely.
There's everything has within it its own glory. And some have more glories than others. But unless the glory speaks to you, you don't see it regardless. And that's not necessarily a measure of your worth as a human being or a reader, right? There's some kinds of glories that appeal to various kinds of people. It's the same with music. There is possibly a time when life will make it such that you would read Anne of Green Gables again and the glory of it would radiate to you. But I don't think in a case of, unless it's Homer, I don't think people really need to feel apologetic if they don't see the glory.
I mean, I'm sure we've all had the experience of reading a good or great book at the wrong time, right? Either when we were too young, maybe we hadn't sinned enough or suffered enough to really understand it, or we were introduced to a good or great book by the wrong teacher, or just read it in the wrong context. I mean, Gary, you're one up on me. I've never actually read Anne of Green Gables, but I know, I'm sorry. I had other things, I guess, that were occupying my time, probably lesser. But I do remember trying to get into various books or authors that people had recommended, and just, you know, either I was too busy or my soul was too shallow at that moment to really be able to appreciate what was there. Not saying that about you, Gary, that you were too busy or your soul was too shallow to, you know, access Anne of Green Gables splendor. But we've all had that experience, or the experience I know that we've all had and people commented on, of coming back to the same great book for the 25th time and continuing to see great riches and depth there, you know, every time you come back to them, in part because you're a different person. And I think that's probably true coming to a great book or a good book for the very first time, too. So great.
And I'll just quickly state that I think if we see it as our role as the teacher is to enable a child to see the glory of the work of art, then that can help us sometimes get past that. Sometimes
I think that's right. Hey, let me throw something out there. This is called disputed questions. So let me generate a little dispute here. Okay, and for this one, I'd like to invite Heidi and Junius and John Mark. And John Mark, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to read a few lines from Junius's essay and a few lines from Heidi's essay, and I would like you to comment on what you hear before we invite Junius and Heidi to respond themselves. All right, so here we go. This is when we're thinking about the characteristics of a great book. What makes a great book great? Lots of times people will refer to the age of a book. And here's what Junius says, thinking about an old book. Junius writes this: first, we must rule out age. great books are not great because they are old. Not every Greek or Roman writer was great. Not every medieval writer was a genius. Not every Victorian writer was witty. These things are, by and large, present in all ages to a similar degree and in similar proportions. Perhaps, he goes on, perhaps the reason we privilege the old is because these books have stood the test of time. And so it seems to us that that must mean something. That must mean it was worth copying over and over again, but this does not follow. We cannot really conclude anything about the survival of a book to our age. All right, that's Junius. Here's Heidi. After she comments on great books or those that influence things, she says, this means that the great books are always old. To be considered great, a book must prove its worth over time, which is why the books of today, or even a century or two ago, are far too young to be considered great. Then she goes on to rule out explicitly Jane Austen and Tolstoy, and by extension, I assume Dostoevsky, Hopkins, Kierkegaard, de Tocqueville, Flannery O'Connor, Ralph Ellison, et cetera, et cetera. So I wonder if I can invite you to comment on what looks like, at the surface at least, an apparent disagreement between the way Junius is thinking about the age of books and Heidi's thinking about the age of books.
So, of course, I have the major difficulty in that I think all books are great. And I tried to argue for that to some extent in my essay. I'm not really keen on the entire notion of great book lists, except in prudential ways. But let me set aside my entirely eccentric opinion. I will say this. I think that there is a role in the great conversation that I think is the essence of classical education. I think we're a method, not a canon. And the canon serves the method. And the canon is going to tend towards older books because they're seminal. So I'm going to give an utterly trivial example. The original fan base, in my opinion, that helped invent the internet was Star Trek. And there are a series of Star Trek products and shows and events, but those original just under 80 episodes of the original series, however inferior they may be in acting and in writing and in television production quality in modern terms, are always going to kind of stand shadowing everything that comes after them. Christopher Pine tries not to play Bill Shatner playing Captain Kirk. Every captain that plays an Enterprise captain tries to not be Captain Kirk, but they're all kind of either reflecting on him, not being him, being him. Riker is a kind of Kirk character. In other words, there's something to be said for something that's seminal and that people kept talking about for thousands of years. Even if Dante ends up being greater than some of the poets he reflects on, he's still reflecting on those poets. And so they'll always have a role for those of us who want to get to the basement of the conversation. So I think it is both absolutely true that most of the garbage has been weeded out. Though as we read the libraries of Pompeii, we may discover new classical literature that's decent. I would argue it probably won't enter the canon because it was lost and it didn't enter the great conversation. And so it would have to be very great indeed. We know we have all of Plato, for example. So maybe we find some of the lost dialogues of Aristotle. But even then, that's not the Aristotle that everybody was reacting to. Metaphysics Zeta will still be more important than what we find for this seminal nature. So that's comment number one. But comment number two, I guess I disagree with the notion that you cannot discern the seeds of greatness in something relatively new. As we make the attempt to do that, we keep the earlier lists in mind, we keep the earlier books in mind, but we begin to dialogue with The Invisible Man or East of Eden. Those would be my two candidates for the great American novel, the two greatest American novels. So as we dialogue with those novels and sort of what they have to say, they're a little more contemporary, though our students wouldn't think of them as contemporary at all. A little closer in time, we can make a judgment that they've endured 50, 60, 70 years as part of the conversation. And so we can make an attempt at introducing them into later conversations. So even if they fall out of the canon, Lord of the Rings is an excellent example. Will people be reading it in 200 years? Maybe not. If I were going to pick a book I loved that I thought might fall out of the canon, Lord of the Rings might fall out, though it invented fantasy literature. So maybe not for that reason. So I would say I sort of agree with the general spirit here, but I don't agree that we shouldn't try out new books on canonical lists. But then I hate canon because I think all books are great.
Okay, so Heidi and Junius, let me invite you guys to both comment, because Junius, you seem to be saying the age of a book is irrelevant to its greatness. Heidi, you seem to be saying the age of a book is essential to its greatness.
I mean, I'll go first
Yeah.
because I'll go first because I gave a specific definition for great books, or criteria, I guess,
Yeah.
for great books in my essay. And which, I got that idea from Aristotle, which is a pretty undisputed great
Appeal
book,
to
right?
authority. There you go.
Define your terms, right?
Right.
So the terms that I defined for great books, or delineated here, are number one, and first, and I think most important, is that a great book is a technical term that refers to a book without which culture and civilization as we know it would not exist the way we know it. And because of that, and the other criteria that I present in my essay is that a great book, capital G, capital B, are books that intentionally talk to books from the past, and the canon itself wouldn't exist without that book within the conversation. So you remove Shakespeare, human culture is different, and the canon is profoundly different. Language is different, philosophy is different, aesthetics are different, right? And with those two criteria, then I argue then a book has to be old, because its influence has to be undeniable. Now, as I say, and I'm going to quote from my essay on this, that I say this qualification is neither pedantic nor pretentious, but practical, right? We do not yet know if world civilization is indelibly marked by Jane Austen or Tolstoy. And then I say probably so, but we cannot be sure. And I stand by that according to my definition. Now, if we're defining great books as something different, which probably Junius is, right? Probably his term, he's using the term differently than I am. And probably everything he'd say based on the term, his definition of the term, I'd probably agree with, right? Like Andrew, you made a really compelling case for Lewis. I don't know if we're still going to be reading Lewis in 500 years, but we sure as heck need him now, right? We need him now. And in that case, I think you can argue that you could consider him a great book, but maybe not by my, by the way I define the term in my essay.
Well, you couldn't, I mean, Heidi, you couldn't define his works as great books by your definition. I mean, you ruled out Jane Austen and Dostoevsky. So it didn't seem like you could include Lewis, right? Just because he's so recent, right?
Exactly. Now, Lewis is my favorite. And that's why I answered the original question that you asked the way I did too. Like I could go back and pick children's stories, things that were profoundly formative to me, but I picked great books by this definitive term. You could probably convince me that maybe the way I define my term can be tweaked, but by the way I defined it, I still stand by my qualifications.
Heidi, can I try something to see if we can agree?
Yeah.
I'm going to pick on Jane Austen because I love her lots, though Jane Eyre is my favorite novel in English, so maybe I should start there. If I wanted to defend reading Jane Austen, I'd say something like this. Because she's closer to us in time and engaged in the great conversation and so near great, I mean, she's pretty far back, right? It's not yesterday that Austen was writing. She can be a more accessible way into deep time.
Yeah.
And since she's a good trusty guide, she's more like a tutor to the greats on your view. And so we read her for fun. And that seems to be the way Lewis himself behaved in his education, where he would read Spencer for fun and was to the end of his life unsure whether they should have allowed English to become a discipline in the university, whether all that modern stuff, and I think he meant Beowulf, has kind of corrupted the university for reasons that you're giving.
Right.
But
I think that that's probably true, which is why I say they probably are great books, right? Like probably we're going to still be reading, probably human culture as we know it will be profoundly different, especially aesthetically because of Austen. Also, Lewis argues that Austen is the last great moral writer in the West, right? Nobody rose to her level since then. He himself argues that, and I think he's right about that. So I'd say, yeah, probably, certainly the novel will never be the same after Austen, or to your point, after Jane Eyre, in which case I think, yeah, but I am defining it very technically, using great not as an adjective, but as but great book as a technical term.
And Heidi, where's that? Yeah, I'm sorry,
go ahead, Brian.
I was
let me
just
just
gonna ask.
Yeah.
You go, because I want to ask her. I'll ask my question, but you just go. I'm just curious where your definition of great books
runs
comes
out.
from. Like where are you pulling that from, or where are you grounding your definition of great books, I guess, along these two criteria?
I think that now I was hoping that question wouldn't come up, Brian, because I do remember reading great book that being defined that way, and I can't remember where I read it. And so I was
I don't know if Adler
nobody asked
defines
me
it
where
like
I
that.
got that, because I know I didn't make it up. Now, I do also say in my essay that most of us will read and enjoy more good books than great ones, and that's the way it's supposed to be, right? We're not just supposed to read the great books. Like, I read way more just really good books than I do the great books. But I was thinking about the essay in terms of what we ought to be teaching in our classrooms to students in order to as classical educators, and in preserving and passing on the tradition, with that idea of this like continuous search for reality, and the first question that we talked about, right? What is it that promotes that? What are these books that have shaped who we are today? And because most of us are going to be reading The Great Gatsby and reading To Kill a Mockingbird, and how then do we teach books that our students might not read without some help and some guidance? In order to like draw their souls to the good, true, and beautiful, and be a guide to them, as Virgil was for Dante. And in thinking about that in my own classrooms at my own school, I'm often thinking, what are these great books that I can guide my students through, that are talking to each other over time, creating this conversation? And so that without which the world that we are passing on to our students wouldn't really exist. And then here's where my definition kind of breaks down, right? Is when you get to like early moderns, right? Because there's so many books that remain influential. Rousseau, Locke, like I always teach Machiavelli, because the world as we know it wouldn't exist without Machiavelli. But Machiavelli also had a lot of was, I think, profoundly wicked in his impact. And I think that has to remain a part of the conversation and what we're talking about great books. So I think as we get newer in or more recent in our teaching, that my definition becomes way more fluid and probably less helpful.
Yeah. No, that's helpful. Junius, let me invite you to comment here too. And then I do want to follow up in a subsequent question on this other criteria of cultural influence, and ask how significant that is to our definition of a great book, given that there might be books that are great, but were passed over for one reason or another. But Junius, on this question of age, what do you hear, and how do you want to respond to Heidi and John Mark?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know, you guys watching this, if you have a sense of just how incredibly cool it is to have all these people together in one place. I mean, I look around the screen and I see people that I love, and Gary, whom I don't really know, but and so
He's great. You would love him.
Gary is super
best.
awesome, but we can see that the romantic part of his soul has been sadly stunted.
It's never too late. Never
Jane
give up
Eyre.
hope.
It's time for some Jane Eyre, Gary. Stat.
I'm a Kierkegaard guy, Gary, so I'm with you there.
I don't like Jane Eyre. And so Brian, this pitting me and Heidi against each other was deeply wounding to my soul, because I've known Heidi the longest, and Heidi is my oldest
questions.
friend.
It's not disputed questions unless there's some disputation.
Well, and Junius,
I'm doing my job.
Meets with my son and teaches him Latin one-on-one. So he's like integral. He's like a great book in our family.
Without which our family
would not be.
am? Goodness gracious. How old have I got to be to be a great book?
Exactly. If Junius is a great book,
Just look at your beard. You meet the criteria.
I just
All
let
right,
her talk and
Junius,
show
Junius, comment
she's
on
taking
this,
her own
though.
definition up. I don't have to say anything. No, so I was really happy to. I was going to ask Heidi to speak first if she would, because I suspected that exactly what happened was what happened, namely that there's equivocation in how she's using great books and how I'm using it. And so I don't disagree with what she's saying, although I would want to nuance it in this way. I think we have to be careful talking about culture and civilization in the West in the singular, because what we have is a succession of civilizations, and many of those civilizations are contemporaneous with one another and have varying degrees of influence and contact with one another, and we're learning from being fed by all these different things. And the thing that makes me, I mean, one of the things that I talked about in the age question in my essay was the fact that we shouldn't have Beowulf. Right? Beowulf is the luckiest manuscript in the history of writing. There's absolutely no reason we have Beowulf and we don't have something like the second book of the Poetics. I mean, this is just proves how weirdly ephemeral history can be. It's either, stupidly random, or there's some evil capricious power, or even just God thinks it's hilarious to let us know that Aristotle wrote the second book of the Poetics and we don't get to read it.
And Junius, we don't have Cicero's Hortensius, right?
Yeah, for
the
example,
book that sparked Augustine. You're like,
which is one of the most
what happened to that?
Influential books
Yep.
for Augustine. We don't even know what's in it, right?
It's a great point.
And so, and all the stuff that the medievals didn't have at certain times and that other medievals did have, and things of this nature. I'm teaching a whole course next year, a 31-week course called Forgotten Epics, looking at epic poetry that was essential to being an educated individual just 60 years ago.
Yeah.
That Lewis and Tolkien would be scandalized that none of us have read these things, right? And yet people don't read them anymore because the canon just changes, right? And so that I've used the analogy before when talking with Chris Perrin about of glaciers. Okay, so I was up in Canada a couple years ago, and we were on this glacier, and you could see below the glacier there was this small lake of glacial meltwater, and the glacier was melting away. And they said, in 20 years this glacier is going to be gone, and there'll be a new lake down there, and it'll probably have the same name that this glacier had. And my first thought was, oh, that's so sad, global warming, climate change, blah blah blah. But then I thought about it, and I was like, hang on, like they've told us that glaciers are formed by snow that just doesn't melt for a bunch of years and it gets packed down. And I realized that glaciers are always forming and melting. Whether that's accelerating or not in our time is a different question, but in some sense, the formation and melting of glaciers is just the planet breathing, right? There's this natural rhythm to it. And I think the canon is the same way, that there are books that come in and out of favor that are being read by everyone and then being read by only a few and whatnot. And over that time, some things wind up getting lost forever and some things get rediscovered. But even among the stuff that's never gone away, that's been there all the way through, there's been a variety of who's reading it and why and what use they're putting it to and how they're reading it and all of that sort of thing. So it's a conversation where certain threads get dropped for a time, only to resurface weirdly in a strange place several centuries later.
Junius, I really think that that's beautiful. Can I try a response that will be, I'm going to dispute the question.
Okay.
And no one is likely to agree with me, but I'm going to give it a try. This is why I tried to argue in my essay that notions of canon and a static canon are not helpful to us as classical educators. I don't like the criteria of great at all. I think as products of humans created in the image of God, any artistic product that exists is going to have some degree of goodness in it, some degree of beauty, and may have some degree of truth. Now, it may be so little that it's not worth our mining in prudential terms, but this is why when you get these near great books that come into the canon for a while and then drop out, or a book is accidentally lost, it's really not terrifically important if we methodologically engage with them by dialectically working with the student to get the precision, the understanding, the joining with the great human conversation. I can start with my papa in West Virginia and work my way back to Plato very easily in very few steps. From the King James he read every day to Plato is a very easy road to travel. And so those conversations with my grandfather were great conversations. So I think when we try to get some artificial notion of a static greatness, we miss out on a near great book like Dracula. You can start with Dracula and get your way to most of the great discussions in the canon. You can start with books from Aksum, Holy Aksum, later Ethiopia, the Portuguese and other influences, the Thomist influences, and work your way back to Plato, to India, to lots of other places. So I'm wondering if the utility of a static canon is bad. Like it tempts us to something that has never existed, is always changing, and we really need to just say, look, here are 3 or 4 reasons we pick the books we pick, and I tried to give them in my essay, but it's not terrifically important you get the canon perfectly.
Yeah. Hey, can I comment on this word canon? I typically think we all use it inappropriately and don't really know it's the wrong word. Like
That's what I was thinking.
canon never meant and never has meant a list of books.
Right.
That's not what it meant originally.
Exactly.
That's not what I don't think that's how we should use canon to refer to a list of books, because I mean, notice the etymology. If in my essay I just comment on this briefly, the etymological similarities between canon and the word cane, right? A canon was simply a yardstick, right? So think of a canon as like it was a stick of designated length against which you measured other things so that you could compare them. Right. So take like a measuring, like a ruler, it's 12 inches long. Well, it's a canon because you use it to measure everything else. It's why like the teachings of the church councils are called what? Canons. The Bible is called canon because you measure your own life and faith against it. So a canon would actually be the distinguishing characteristics of great books against which we measure any book. So we would say great books do these kinds of things. They have these kinds of qualities. And then we would say, take any book, take Dostoevsky, take The Republic, take the comedy. Does it measure up against the canon of these criteria? And maybe it's only like 10 inches, whereas another one is 12 inches and one is 1 inch. I mean, the canon does not refer to a list of books. And if we use it like that, then we're using it in an utterly unique way that it's not the way it's ever been used. So I just think the idea of a canon of books is not really that helpful, because then what happens is we start talking about the great books. And I note that Frederick Harrison, the first guy to use this phrase, he doesn't talk about the great books. He simply talks about great books versus little books. And if you start saying the canon and the great books, then you start drawing these boundaries around, you know, a certain selection of books. And I just don't find that helpful or useful or really part of the tradition.
Yeah. I think in terms of a totally different definition for canon than what you've said, and for the word great. For canon, in my mind, I think of them as human storybooks. A canon is a collection of books that tells a story of a people. So that's how I think of canon, and that whatever is in it is important because it helps you understand a story of a people. So when I think of the word great, I don't think of the word better than. I think of the term, how I would say, I want to give you a great big hug. Doesn't mean I'm gonna hug you better than I'm gonna hug another person. It just means it's huge, it's all embracing, it's all encompassing. So when I take the term, first, when I look at the word canon in my mind, another word I use sometimes just in my own mind is human storybooks. And I say, well, this set of human storybooks has embraced or given a great big hug to this certain set of people. And so that's how I think about it. That's how I welcome, diverse authors into Mortimer Adler's canon, not because his canon is better than others or that I'm measuring it against others, is that he has collected these books to say, if we read these, you'll have a pretty good understanding of the Western tradition or this people group, right? Yeah. And then who else has this story or have these collection of storybooks embraced? Or the flip of that, the reciprocal of that, who has embraced them, right? And so we can find groups of people that have also embraced the canon and it has inspired them. And so it kind of builds from there, because if we talk about them as a measuring book, but because then we're measuring the African American canon, which includes the Negro spirituals and other. Then we're measuring it against that, because Mortimer Adler, God bless him, said something about, he wants to kind of look at the Eastern canon, but he wasn't quite sure, I got to find the quote, how it measured up to the canon he had. And I think we get in trouble when we start taking collections of books and say they are a measuring stick for other traditions or other canons. Right. But I do think, if you think about them all, that each set of canons, whether it be the Bible, the biblical canon, or whatever, and we respect them, but then allow them to be in conversation with other canons, then it seems more equitable that way.
Let me just clarify, and maybe I wasn't being clear there. The canon, when I say it never, I'm saying it never refers to a collection of books. What it refers to are the defining properties or characteristics that could be in any book that makes it great. So when we talk about books that are, in books that are, enliven our souls and teach us, plant seeds of reality, or that are spiritually sustaining or nutritional, or that, enliven our spirits, that which is true, good, and beautiful, those are actually canon. Those are the list of criteria against which any book could be measured. So any book from any era, from any time period, could measure up to the canon of great making criteria. That's how I'm using it. So I'm not saying that, I'm certainly not saying that Mortimer Adler's list of books is the canon against which anything else is measured. I think he doesn't have a canon. He has a list of books that he says measured up to the canon of great making criteria, whatever that great making criteria is. But it's the criteria that should be described as the canon, not a designated set of books.
And I know Andrew wants to jump in here, and I'm going to want to respect that, but just real quick, that's the distinction between what Heidi was offering and what I was offering. I was trying to offer a canon in that second sense. How do you recognize whether a book you're reading is great in this term or not? Which would not be the same thing as saying worth reading, right? And so that's the approach I took in my essay.
Yeah, and then I want to make sure we get Carol and Gary in here. I've got other questions, but Carol and Gary. Andrew, do you want to say something? Then I'm going to invite Carol to jump into this.
Unmute first, Andrew.
I can hold it because it will be perceived as provocative.
Disputed questions. We like disputation. Okay, well then hold it. But Carol, do you want to weigh into this conversation here about where we are now, talking about canon or age of books?
It's an interesting question for me, given that I wrote my dissertation, I did my doctoral work on Xenophon's memorabilia, and people know who Xenophon is now sometimes. I would argue that they're great books and that they teach us to raise the questions about what makes us human and how we learn to govern ourselves together, living in a community, and how we navigate the tensions between the individual and the city, and how we create laws that are moderate and prevent extremes and tyranny and so on. And I think that books that are really great can fall into disfavor when people do sort of when people become rigid about the books that they think are great. Plato is great. Xenophon was just a sort of common soldier that nobody thought very highly of or took very seriously. But I think when we're serious about the questions that we pursue through books, and we look to those, we look for books that teach us about what the human is and how we can understand it fully across the curriculum, across philosophy, literature, science, politics. And Locke's Second Treatise is one of the most formative books for me of all time. Not to mention Machiavelli's Prince, by the way. I think I think that we often in classical education talk about the pursuit of the true, the good, and the beautiful. And I think that the focus tends to be often on the good and the beautiful. And sometimes the true is not beautiful. It's beautiful in the sense that we know that we have knowledge of it, but the consequences of it, Machiavelli teaches us that if we're going to conquer a neighbor, we're going to have to eliminate all the bloodlines. It's not a beautiful teaching, but there's something he's a teacher of a kind of realism that teaches us a lot about politics and public life. So I think there are a lot of diverse criteria about what makes a great book and what we can learn from these books when we take them all seriously. But I also don't think that we should disregard the criteria. I am a great reader of a lot of different kinds of books too, but I'm not sure that I would be willing to say that they're all great. So I'll just leave it at that.
Yeah, I guess, Carol, what I'm willing to say is that all books are in principle great enough and to spur the dialectic if they were produced by humans. And second, I think that we should be full of wonder because we have all eternity as souls created in the image of God to dialogue and to study and to learn. I expect to find great books everywhere. Like I turn my head and I think, Wizard of Oz, that's a pretty great book. It's captivating. It's like the Odyssey. It's the American fairy tale. If I'm an American and I don't read that first Baum book, he's a one-hit wonder. His other books are like pretty bad, like Atlases of Oz. But
they're still great because you say all books are great.
Yeah, because I could do a seminar that way. I started a seminar once with Buffy the Vampire Slayer, brought in one of the writers from Buffy, and we discussed Buffy. We got backwards to Dracula. We worked our way through Dracula, reading Varney the Vampire, of all things, from a Penny Dreadful. But by the time you were done with that, there was very little of civilization or Christianity you hadn't talked about, even in hapless Varney. And trust me, you don't have time to read Varney, but you can have fun with it.
I think you need to make a distinction, John Mark.
What?
I think you need to make a distinction between intrinsic and extrinsic greatness, because I don't think you're really arguing that these books are great, rather that these books can serve great ends.
Yeah, I think they have the seeds of greatness in them because they're the product of human souls created in the image of God.
Yeah, but John Mark, you'd have to say that given the corruption of human nature, not all books plant seeds of reality in us, right?
No,
I mean, I buy a lot, and I see a lot of books for sale, and a lot of the kind of bookshops in airports that I don't think plant seeds of reality in us, right?
I think they could if carefully examined, but I would say it's imprudent to use them. They're not good for me, for example. There's some books I shouldn't look at because I can't handle them. I couldn't find whatever it is that's left of the Imago Dei. And secondly, it's not worth the effort. If I pick up the Republic, I can endlessly think about the last line of the Republic and have my soul transformed. I know this because I've done it for decades. If it doesn't work for you, that's fine. I guess my point is the product of the image of God, there's always some goodness, truth, and beauty to it. And so I don't want to limit things. I always want to be able to turn a corner and find a great book. I mean, a really great book by anybody's definition. Or we're starting with Gary, a book that works for a lot of people, but doesn't work for Gary. I don't have to define that as sub-great or something. Like, there are just so many great books and there's so many notes in the orchestra. And some of them, Brian, are crush notes. They're notes that by themselves would be off key and off kilter, but they keep the choir from being monotonously perfect. Where everybody's hitting the same note from sounding like an AI invention.
So John Mark, can I ask you a question?
Yeah, please. And I don't want to stick the conversation here on my eccentric view, but
is there such a thing as a great book?
No, I don't think so. Because I think all products of human imagination have the seeds of greatness, Junius and Heidi, in them. It's just that I have to teach in the English language primarily, so I'm trying to lean that way. I'm teaching particular kids in a particular place and time at the end of a tradition, and I like the scientific revolution and what came of it. And I like Christianity and what came of it, Orthodox Christianity. I think it's true. And so I'm trying to deal with the roots of those things in a continuing conversation. But I would expect that if I were parachuted, had to go to Mongolia right after the fall of communism, and they were trying to recapture authentic Mongolian culture after being bent by the Soviets for about 50, 60 years. And I would expect, if I knew anything, if I knew Mongolian, that I would find great literature inside the Mongolian culture, and that it would be wonderful, that I could be staggered by it. However, even if I made a great books list in Mongolia, I tried to argue that because the scientific revolution is so inescapable, and because, and this is where this is a belief I have, I believe the revelation of God in Jesus Christ presents us an undeniable metaphysical reality. I think that that will really shape a commonality of canon wherever I went.
So one more question.
Yeah.
And I agree with you on everything you just said, 100%, and still believe there is such a thing as a great book.
Yes, you could, because I don't want to fall into
that's
like
where I'm at.
Yeah, I don't want to fall into the Socratic fallacy of saying, oh, well, here's a definition. I just don't like the definition. What I want to say is I'd like to look at books this way, but I also agree that there's a useful thing to do with starting with a definition like you gave, Heidi, and then saying, okay, then what comes of that? How does that help me? Because I think we all are in schools or colleges or in our own lives. We have to make the prudential decision. What do I read? So nobody should leave here unless they just love vampire literature and read Varney the Vampire, because on the list of things people have time to read, it shouldn't be that. But I actually love the Brontes enough that I actually looked up all their source books that they mention. There's a novel on novels, and I read them, and probably no one should do that. I'm a completist, so because of time. We should all go reread Jane Eyre or Wuthering Heights or Anne of
Green
I'm
Gables.
literally rereading Jane Eyre right now with my daughter. So
we should have a webinar about Jane Eyre, because I also, we had just a small dispute with one of my colleagues where he said that Jane Eyre was better than Jane Austen. We don't have to have that discussion right now. And I insisted that I may have impolitely said he was wrong. And then that seemed too definitive. So then I felt that I should reread Jane Eyre so that I could ask him again more politely why he prefers Jane Eyre. At which point, by the way, he conceded that he thought maybe Jane Austen is better, but he likes Jane Eyre better. So that was just...
Which is fine.
I can only say that Jane Eyre saved my soul in an important sense. So it may be that I'm influenced by that. It
I don't
had
like Jane Eyre.
salvific properties for me.
And this is, I think this is an important point that we don't, I mean, on the one hand, what John Mark's saying, yes, of course you're going to find great literature in Mongolia. I think you're also going to find bad literature in Mongolia. Just because you can, I mean, there are bad books that are just not very good. That doesn't mean you can't do good things with them. But and that's not about, I have a broader canon than most people. I wrote a book arguing that fantasy literature needs to be included in our classical teaching. So I'm not arguing for a very strict elitist canon. But I think something that's been a thread that's run through this whole conversation that we ought to name more explicitly for everyone on this call, whether they're panelist or viewer, is that it is fundamentally okay to not like great books. Just because they're great doesn't mean you're going to like it or that you have to like it. And that's part of what I was getting at in my criterion, is I wanted to give a criterion of greatness that truly allowed us to separate pulp fiction from more serious fiction, because I think that is a meaningful separation to make. And we need to make it so I have a way of telling people, yes, this is worth your time to read, and no, this is not worth your time to read. But at the same time, that it made space for the fact that you might hate Dostoevsky, and there's nothing necessarily, there may be something wrong with you, but there may not. In that fact, if there's something wrong with it, there is something wrong with you. But the fact that you don't like Dostoevsky is not evidence of that. That's just another thing that's going on there. And so to me, the issue is, because what makes books great is exactly what John Mark is saying. It's humanity, right? And so, and I am a human, and not humanity, and I can't be all humans, and therefore there have to be parts of human artistic production that I don't connect to because I'm not human enough in the relevant ways. And that's part of why part of what makes humanity a symphony is that we all play our parts. I can't play every note in the orchestra on my horn. Some of them are too high or too low, but I can play my notes. Right.
Mm-hmm. I want to bring Gary in here, but what we're just one comment, John, I think that a lot of us might feel is that it's one thing to say that all books are great, or to Junius's point, all books can get us to great insights. We still have to select a certain limited number of books in our curricula. And so we still have to have some criteria to say, what am I going to teach my students or introduce to them in the limited amount of time that I think they need for their souls in this moment in time in their particular context. So, you know, I think that might be a further question. But before we go there, Gary, do you want to weigh in on any of this? This debate right here.
Oh, any of this. So yeah, I think I tend to agree with John Mark. Though there was a comment in the comment chat about, well, is this sort of like that line from The Incredibles? If everything is great, then nothing is. Yeah, I mean, it does, I think, tend to have that effect. And then I'm very sympathetic to the idea that these decisions come down to matters of prudence, like how am I going to spend my time? What kind of person am I? What kind of things do I enjoy, right? So yeah, reading forms us in certain ways. But then I also enjoy reading certain types of books, and I don't enjoy reading other types of books. I think that's got to be okay. And as long as, right, there aren't certain moral or intellectual failings going on there, then people in many ways should just read what they like and read what they enjoy. And sometimes when I think about, in particular, students who go through educational programs, and even great books, or maybe even especially great books, educational programs, they come out and they now think of the great books as a kind of subject matter.
Yep.
And as something that they were forced to study, and that has turned them off to it. And they might, it will be very difficult for them because of how they're approached, sort of intellectually, academically, to really get back in the sort of reading these books again. So, I think there are things that teachers can do and even administrators can do to sort of mitigate that. But I think it is a real danger that we sort of, in many ways, sort of force these books on people as educators.
Though let me bring a comment in here from Bill Isley in the chat, and then Carol, will go to you. And this is something that Frederick Harrison brings out in his original essay in 1886. He writes it in order to tutor this young girl so she can develop literary prudence, so that she knows what she ought to read and what she ought to avoid. And Bill Isley just comments in the chat here, we need to choose for our students great books that shape them so they can recognize great books and distinguish them from others. There's probably a kind of mentoring that goes on there, and a kind of tutoring that goes on by the kinds of books that we introduce our students to. So we almost develop their taste for a certain kind of book, maybe. I mean, right, because I hear you. I mean, Gary, read the books you like. Well, there might be books that I don't like that I need to read, right? My soul might need to read some books that I might not be drawn to because they might be hard for me in my soul, or I might not know the books my soul needs, or I might not know, I might not recognize, what my soul needs. But Carol, you wanted to jump in here.
The point that I wanted to make was something very sort of similar, that that I don't think that I'm not willing to go to the extent to say that content doesn't matter. I think that what we read and what we introduce to students, what we share with them and lead them through is formative. I've taught lots of university students who had never read a great book, and they get to reading those great books through the study of political science, for example, and they suddenly say, this is what I thought university was going to be. Somehow I was going to be reading books that raised the questions that led me to discuss, what the human things, what the big questions are for human beings. And there are a lot of students out there who, and children, we're teaching in classical programs, or you're teaching in classical programs, and I'm representing them, and I don't think that we can say that content doesn't matter, because I worry about that. In fact, I think there are a lot of movements out there, a lot of teaching out there that says, as long as students are reading, that's fine. I think that forming the tastes for the kinds of books that address the questions in the human soul, that teach people what it means to be human and to be serious human beings, I think we're in danger of losing that, and that it's important.
Yeah,
Hey,
I don't.
Oh yeah.
On that, I don't want to be misunderstood and could be easily misunderstood. Even if I believed or asserted that all books in principle could be beneficial, that doesn't mean that all books are beneficial for me or for the group of people I'm teaching. In fact, they could be terrible for me and for the group of people I'm teaching, or they could be imprudent or a waste of time. So I want to stress, I think books are for people, not people for books. And classical education are for the people we have in front of us, the particular freshmen coming in this class, for whom I think the Iliad can unlock great treasures. It's the first book I teach college freshmen every single year. But every single year, it's hard in a new way. And I have to find new ways to help them get to the Iliad and as one student puts it, put the cookies on the bottom shelf for them early on as freshmen. And then by the time they're seniors, I don't have to do that. They do develop good taste, and more things are open to them. But I've had plenty of students that I counseled against reading Nietzsche. So we'd get to a point like in their junior year where they turned to Nietzsche, but they had a cast of soul, like pre-suicidal, for example, for whom Nietzsche was just going to be destructive. And I told them they didn't have to read that. They could pick something else. So I don't, even on the most extreme view of what I said, I'm not saying all content is good for all of us or prudent. I think I designed curriculum around students, not the other way around.
Andrew, can I ask you to comment here something you put in the chat about Lewis's potential response to the way this some of the lines of this conversation? You said you wanted to be provocative.
Oh, that?
No, he said he would be perceived as provocative. You have to watch Andrew with his terminology.
Ooh.
It might not be provocative, but it might be perceived as provocative.
Ooh.
I say that in all friendly.
You're right.
And then I do want to we have a question in the chat box that I'd like to get to, and but do you want to comment on your comment?
I want to do this as carefully as I possibly can, so bear with me. I would offer you an ideal against that none of us will ever attain, but against which we can measure ourselves. In a lighthearted, true but easy to dismiss way, I would put it this way, that a great work of art is one in which the proportion of reward to suffering is the greatest. And therefore, if there's no suffering, there's no reward. Now, having said that, the reason for that is, well, no context. What I meant about Lewis is that I believe what I've heard so far is primarily pragmatic, sophistic, relativistic, and subjectivist reasons for identifying a book as great. And Lewis, in That Hideous Strength, which is a book that keeps getting talked about, and The Poison of Subjectivism, and Abolition of Man, labors to make the case that there are objective standards. And if there are, then we have to know at least what he means by an objective standard. If we don't then say, and now I can say whether this is good or bad. Okay, and I need to emphasize that qualifier. I believe that there are objective standards of greatness in the arts, but that doesn't mean that I know them. And it doesn't mean that I am capable of judging whether a work is great or not. But if there are, in fact, objective standards, then somebody could write a novel tonight, publish it tomorrow, and it would be great if it was great, regardless of whether anybody right now notices that it is. Now, having said that does, and here, Gary, you might appreciate this, that does not mean that it's absolutely objective, because the absolute contains within itself the relative. And so the relations of the work of art and the values and the subjective and relative and sophistic and pragmatic criteria all have their place within an objective criterion. Okay, so this is what I would offer to you as the objective criterion of a work of art, and then I'll briefly state what I think it implies for us. A work is great. Well, in my essay, I use the term logos. If it embodies a logos, that's really worth embodying, and it does it well. But I would offer here, I'll say there's logos and kalos. Okay, there's the good, there's the logos. Okay, and I would argue that in Christ those things are convertible. There's the logos and there's the good. Therefore, what we need to do is gain the wisdom to determine and judge whether a work is objectively good to the degree that we can. But I think only God ultimately can do that. Nonetheless, just as we can't become holy overnight, we still have to strive for it, especially as teachers, because we're responsible for it. And therefore, what I would offer as the practical applications are, number one, we need to learn how to encounter the transcendent, whatever that means. We need to learn how to encounter the transcendent in any artifact that we encounter. We need to teach people how to do that. And that means that they have to learn how to read. In every sense of that phrase, they have to learn how to read, and we have to learn how to read. Second of all, what we're doing tonight has to happen, which is to say a discussion where each of us dares to put out an opinion, tear each other apart, listen to each other, engage in a friendly, loving dialectic, because it's in the dialectic that we come to see the mysteries that we can't see just by reading the book, right? We can't, I mean, we can rise to wisdom through a dialectic like we're having. And then thirdly, through that, we can acquire, I believe, we can acquire informed good taste. And good taste is, was it Gary that just said that? Good taste is absolutely critical, because if we enjoy the wrong things, we'll destroy ourselves. And so a taste for the good, that's what Plato, that's what the scriptures, that's what, I mean, we say that education is what the cultivation, the good love, learning to love what you're supposed to love, right? So all of that being said, then I think we have to accept that it's very difficult to acquire good taste, that we have to be apprenticed and mentored in it. We have to engage in lots of discussions, and we have to do it with the humility of receptivity is the way I would put it. Because as I said before, I think every artifact, and this is where I agree with John Mark's point, that every artifact ever made by man, from the two-year-old baby saying something to Michelangelo making the Pieta, every artifact ever made by man is a miracle, and has within it a glory. But not every glory is equal, and some glories nourish our souls better than others because there's more glory, there's more kalos, there's more logos. So the objective point, the objective stance that I would hold to, and I have to emphasize crucially that I'm not saying that what I'm saying is it's really hard to fulfill this, but we have to begin with faith. The objective point is that there is objective goodness, and it's good for the soul, and we need to make it the task of our souls as teachers and learners to learn how to identify that. But it will never boil down to rules, and it will never boil down to, except rules will tell us when we've screwed up, but it will never boil down to moving parts around methods and techniques. It will always boil down to, it won't boil down at all. It will always involve gazing on the glory of things and absorbing into our souls the glory of the thing we're gazing on.
Hey, several people have had hands up here. Thank you, Andrew, for that. I really appreciate that, and I think we all do. I wonder if we can just hear from Anika and Carrie and Gary, who've had their hands up waiting patiently, and then get to our one question in the chat box down here. But Anika, what do you want to add to this and comment on this?
I hope my power will stay, my internet will work for me to keep my camera on. I want to go back to what Andrew was saying about the dialectic, and I want to also connect it to what someone said, that we should all just be able to read the books that we love. At first, I was really connecting to that, but then I don't think I would have ever come into loving the classical tradition if I lived by that. And when I think about many of the students I work with and different people I've met, they don't naturally want to read from the tradition. They don't want to read some of the books I'm presenting to them. But once they have to read them for an assignment, a whole world opens up for them, and they are actually able to engage in the dialectic. If we only read what is comfortable for us, and this is not just for students of color, I'm talking about even all people. You know, it's very easy for us to just be comfortable in those spaces and in that literature that resonates with us or makes us feel comfortable, that we can easily grasp or understand. But when we step outside of that and read something maybe we wouldn't pick up and read, we may find ourselves learning about someone who doesn't think like, look like, or believe like us. And then we can engage in these disputed questions and have this civil discourse. If we are not brave enough to read outside of what we may naturally want to choose, then it'll be difficult for us to be able to participate in the dialectic. And I really believe the dialectic is the answer to our healing, to engage in these difficult conversations. So when we read a book that says outside of our heritage, outside of what we think is a canon, or our canon, when we read that, we are actually engaging in dialectic with someone from the past. You know, when you read some of these people who are outside of the Western tradition, who found inspiration in the Western tradition, they engaged in a conversation with these people and found so many answers to their struggle, even found answers to their own humanity when that was in question. And they were engaged in a conversation with someone who did not look like them, did not think like them, was not from where they were, and maybe not have even had the same experience, but somehow in engaging in that conversation through reading the literature, they found healing, hope, answers, a way forward. Mm-hmm. And we practice that with like we're doing right now. Like we're all so different, right? We're all from different places, different beliefs. Maybe no, I don't think we're all from different beliefs, but we have different perspectives, I'll say. But here we are in this disputed question, loving one another, you know, but yet disagreeing with one another. And this is kind of like a small sample of what is possible. And so reading outside of what we want or what we, you know, so this is also a plea for you to read Anne of Green Gables, and I'll stop there.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Anika. Carrie, you had your hand
Yeah, I did.
in.
That was a while ago. I'm trying
Yeah.
to remember what I was going to say, but we in the chat we were talking a little bit about what is the teacher's role in helping students love the things that are worth loving. Students come into our classrooms even in college and they don't even know what they don't know. And, they don't even know the question to ask. They don't even know what is a good book. And I remember when I didn't know, in educating new classical teachers, a lot of them don't know. They're still trying to, figure out what is a good poem, what is a good book, especially at the grammar level when, they're not necessarily reading all of the ancient epics. And, so what is a good book? And so I really just think the role of the teachers, we're the curator, we're curating something that can help them for the time that we have them with us, giving them kind of the best bang for the buck. And I know this is probably pragmatic, but just being able to kind of set a feast in front of them so that they know how to unlock, which books will help them unlock other books to then unlock other books and more books, and then kind of be able to see what is worth loving out there. And we do that in relationship, like Anika was saying, and Andrew was saying, we do that in relationship together. First, I think as a relationship with the teacher and student, and then together as we kind of figure that out and lead each other towards truth.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's beautiful. Gary, and I think we do that. Just I like Gary's. If you read Gary's essay, his approach to this, he distinguishes between the kind of Methodism, particularism. Methodism starting with a kind of criteria that a lot of us gave, and a lot of you who write on this gave, like the great books do these kinds of things to our soul and into society. And then the particularist approach says, let's start with the Iliad. Whatever that is a great book, and working back from there. And I think by offering our students both the experience of the particular and then helping reflect on what that particular is doing to them, you're helping them develop the literary prudence and the loves and the tastes that they need, that without somebody else to do that for them, they will unlikely to develop that on their own. It might happen, it most likely won't happen. And that's why we are there to help them, to help apprentice them, as you just said. Gary, you had your hand up too. Do you want to weigh in on this? And then we did have a question from Christian Webster, which relates to some of what we're talking about. How do we help family members or help our students develop this kind of love for these kinds of books? And we'll have to end pretty quickly. But Gary, what did you want to add here? How did you want to weigh in on this?
Yeah, so a couple of things, and I'll try and go really quick. One is that I'll never forget, and this speaks to what many of my colleagues and new friends here have said. A couple years ago, teaching in the Honors College Great Books program, the first semester, all about ancient Greece, Iliad, Odyssey, Greek drama, Greek history. And about 6 weeks in, so we were probably somewhere around, Euripides or Herodotus, a student if you're a teacher, when the student comes like halfway to your door, like literally the physical doorway, they don't want to come into the office because that's intimidating, but they do want to talk to you. And this student, I remember clearly, he had a very low GPA in high school, but an incredibly high test score. And that stood out to me, and he was part of our program. And he said to me just simply, he said, thank you. I didn't know you could do this. And I said to him, what do you mean? What didn't you know we could do? And he said, I didn't know you could read books and talk about them. And I'll never forget that, right? That was it. That was the breakthrough for him, was you can read books, right? They're not like punishments, right? Or they're not, and you can talk about them, because up until then, his experience had been, you read books so that you can take quizzes on them.
Yeah.
Or you read books because the teacher doesn't have anything else for you to do with your time. And I think that's a fundamentally human response, that we can read books and talk about them. And in a way, I think of a lot of what I do sort of after that as just sort of, we're in the bonus round at that point, right? Once a student has, or any human being, doesn't have to be a student, but once you realize we can read books and talk about them, okay, then great. Well, then you're now motivated to do that. So that's one thing. Another thing, to Andrew, I wonder, and maybe we can follow up with this later, I wonder how we would read and understand Lewis's book, Experiment and Criticism, because I think he actually defends a version of what sort of John Mark was articulating, and I'm sympathetic.
He absolutely does. You're right.
Yeah. Another thing that comes to mind is that, so there's a 20th century German philosopher, Austrian philosopher, Edmund Husserl, wrote a book called The Crisis of European Sciences and Transcendental Phenomenology. In that book, he points out that he was writing in between the world wars. And he said for him, he can't even listen to Beethoven's Ninth Symphony anymore. Like, what is the point of that? Especially with the fourth movement and the triumphal, right? And that always reminds me, like, is Beethoven a great work of art? Yeah. Is the Ninth Symphony probably his best work of art? Maybe second after the seventh, but and the quartets, right? So maybe third, but yeah, but then Husserl himself and a whole generation of people, in a sense, literally could not experience it that way. Like, for them, it was almost an insult or some kind of joke. And I think this maybe in a way dovetails maybe culturally with John Mark's point about, like, we just have to be prudential about these things, and maybe not just have to be prudential, but we ought to be prudential.
We have to be prudential, yes.
Yeah, yeah. And there was one or two other things, but I'm interested in, I think it was Ms. Webster's question.
Well, yeah, Christian Webster here, and it relates, I think, to the question, how do we help our students who are inframed, to use Heidegger's term, inframed by technology? How do we help our family members who have never encountered these kind of texts? How do we help them approach them, love them, experience the wonder and beauty and life-giving seeds they plant in us? How do we bring them to that? Here's Christian's question. I grew up in a low-income household with no exposure to classical texts. I came to know and love the great books through my college curriculum. Shout out to Dr. Gary Hartenburg. How do I communicate the value of these great books to those in my family who find them unapproachable? How do I communicate that the struggle of reading them is itself valuable? I mean, that's the question kind of for educators. How do we introduce our students to these? I'm deeply inclined to go to poetic knowledge and poetic experience, Carrie, that you have to, I mean, here's where my example of this is, oh my God, I'm just blanking on his name. Great Shakespearean actor.
Branagh?
You're
Kenneth
good,
Branagh.
Branagh.
Sorry, I saw him play Hamlet back in '93. How could I forget? He said, I hated Shakespeare all through high school because all we did was read him, and I was told that I was supposed to love him. And then I went to my first Shakespeare play, and I fell in love. He had to have the poetic experience of encountering the beauty and the greatness of Shakespeare performed before he could come around to wanting to read any more Shakespeare at all. And there's some version of that with my students when they come in as freshmen. first thing I do with them in my Good Life class is we read the Odyssey. But the first two books are performed in a reader's theater by my upperclassmen when we're sitting around a mountain lake up in the Adirondacks. And then I lead them into a discussion about their own souls in Telemachus, right? So they experience the kind of wonder and delight of starting this story that way. Then they're like, oh, this is pretty cool. I've never experienced this before. But Andrew, how would you answer this question? How do we help students or family members encounter these texts that we know to be great because we've experienced them? Other people have had the same experience. They've translated across space and time to, pick up Junius's thread there. How do we introduce students and other people to these kinds of texts? And we'll have
Brian,
to end with a few comments here.
Would
Yeah,
it be
Andrew.
insubordinate of me to say Carrie had her hand up first, and so perhaps?
Oh, I didn't see that. Carrie, absolutely.
Well, I'll just be really quick. So I'm having an Anna Green Gables party July 25th, and you all are invited, where we will drink raspberry cordial and elderberry wine. And that's my way of just a gift that I give to the community of people around me, of teachers, to just have fun with the book and experience and love it. And then maybe we'll read, something different that might be on the spectrum closer to the greatest of the great books, but we got to start somewhere. So we're going to start with Anne this summer.
Gary, you're in Texas. Carrie's in Arkansas.
Come
That's
on
not
up,
too
Gary.
far away. I mean, it's a short drive, right?
I promise I'll help you change your mind.
Gary's having a Xenophon party.
Counter programming,
right.
me and Carol. Reading
That's great.
genuine classics.
Andrew, over to you then. How do we help people encounter these books in such a way that they come to love them, and so that their tastes for these kinds of texts that explore the human condition in rich and beautiful ways come to be the kinds of things they are not only love, but then are capable of doing and want to do?
Well, I think Gary's right that you follow what Lewis said in Experiment and Criticism. And the way I would simplify that, because I have a minute, is you start with the glory, right? It's the glory first. You have to show the glory. Every story you guys have told about how Branagh didn't like, this guy didn't like, the reason we don't like things is because we don't see the glory of it. And you go to school to see a murdered carcass and you dissect it, and there's no glory in that. And so you lose your taste for it. Show them the glory. It's exactly what Moses said to the Lord, after sight, show me thy glory. And if I may, I hope this is not out of place, but my book launch is at our pre-conference, and that's the theme of the book, is the temple shows us the pattern for how to teach. And if we start with the glory of the artifact, of the thing that we want, of the truth, then the glory manifests itself and the logos becomes evident to us. And everything else follows from that. We learn how to read, we learn how to interpret, we learn how to discuss, we learn how to engage in a dialectic, because the glory arouses love. The love arouses desire for union and a desire for blessing. The love then leads us to an understanding. We cannot understand without love. And then once we understand, then we start to engage in the parts, the elements, moving the pieces around, rearranging, getting practical, all of that follow, but the glory has to come first. And I think that's why what I was saying about the objectivity, I hope that didn't come across as like some kind of static, fixed, rigid objectivity. Objective reality is dynamic and contains the relative. But you start with the glory, you gaze on the glory, and everything flows from that. And I think that's poetic knowledge. I think that's experiment and criticism. I think that's the common experience that we all have every day of our lives.
Well, friends, thank you for this. This is good. I mean, I'm grateful to Classical Academic Press for hosting these. And anybody watching, this is why we're doing these disputed questions. And you'll see, the dozen of us here for the last 2 hours conversing about this. This is what we do, because these questions are living questions, and we're all groping to figure out ways to think about them and to articulate them. And so I'm grateful to everybody here. So thank you to panelists. Thank you to people who are attending, and thank you to Classical Academic Press. And I look forward to more conversations, you know, with each other about these topics, and certainly sparked by so many of the great books that so many of us love in common. So with that, we will have to say goodbye and wrap it and call it a night. So thank you, folks.